You're told you have to wait for the music to go off, and it honestly feels like you're sat up here for hours waiting. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sarah Armstrong-Smith. I'm here to tell you about the biggest cybersecurity engineering program in history. But before I get into that, I need to give you a little bit of a backstory. Now, I'm sure you've all heard of Microsoft. Microsoft's been around for 50 years. We are the granddaddy of big tech. Honestly, when you kind of think about it, we've got a big target on our back. Every man and their dog, every cyber attacker known to man is trying to gain access to Microsoft or our customers. So I'm going to take you on a little bit of a journey with regards to Microsoft being in the crosshairs of some very significant cyber attackers, and what do we do about it? Kind of to get things started, I want to kind of think about what do storms, typhoons, and blizzards all have in common? Well, ultimately, this all comes down to how does Microsoft attribute different threat actors. Now, to give you a little bit of perspective, Microsoft is one of the most attacked entities in the world. I think we're only second to the US Department of Defense. And if they're not trying to get access to Microsoft, they're trying to gain access to our customers. Now, we used to name threat actors after elements on the periodic table. We actually ran out of elements. We are actively tracking 1,500 large-scale threat actors, of which half of those are state actors. And that's what I'm going to be talking about. So I said, what's the difference between a storm, a typhoon, and a blizzard? Well, in essence, a storm is a threat actor that we cannot 100% attribute to. It's a new campaign, something we haven't seen. And I'm going to be talking about one of those storms in particular. Now, we also refer to the big four. So you've got Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. Now, as you've seen from that slide, there are multiple other countries, not just those big four. But in essence, we refer to China as typhoon and blizzard as Russia. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about that. So what are they after? Why are they after IT service providers? Now, if I go back a little bit more, in 2023, it was fairly normal. You'd expect government to be at the top. State actors, who were they targeting? Fast forward another year, all of a sudden, IT service providers becomes the top target. 24% of all state actor attacks are after IT. Why? Now you think about it, how much effort does it take for me to attack you through the front door? Now I'm thinking you've got a lot of security, a good of security controls and monitoring. Can you go head to head with a state actor? So ultimately, if I can't attack you through the front door, I'm coming at you through the back door. And I'm going to use those trusted relationships. And what do I know about IT, managed service providers? They're going to have privileged access into your environment. And that ultimately is what I'm after. So let me take you on this journey. And I've talked about these storms, blizzards, and typhoons. So back in June 2023, you may have heard Microsoft was actively targeted by a group that we call Storm 0558. They are one of the typhoons. They're from China. And in essence, they're high precision targeting, trying to gain a backdoor access to Microsoft in order to gain access to the federal government, the US federal government and other governments, trying to gain access to their email. Now, as a result of that, people quite rightly kind of turn around and say, well, if people can gain access to Microsoft, what is there for the hope for the rest of us? And so that, in essence, launched in November 2023, Microsoft Secure Future Initiative, and that's what I'm going to be talking about. But it didn't stop there. So just a couple of months later, so January of last year, we were actively targeted by a Russian threat actor called Midnight Blizzard. You may have heard of them. They used to be called Nebelium. They are the threat actor behind SolarWinds. We still regard as one of the most sophisticated cyber attacks that we've ever seen. So why a Midnight Blizzard after Microsoft? Now, the interesting thing is, the why is very interesting, more so maybe than how they got in. So we roll the clock back to the Russian invasion of Ukraine back in 2022. Now, Microsoft, just like some other big tech service providers, went right through the middle. And in essence, not only did we help Ukraine move multiple ministries to the cloud, we also deployed multiple different security technologies and intelligence, blocking, in essence, Russia's destructive cyber attacks. So that means that Microsoft was in the crosshairs. And in essence, in January 2004, we identified they were trying to gain access to some very, very specific people in Microsoft, in our threat intelligence team. They want to know, how are you attributing Microsoft? How do you track? What are you doing? And in essence, they were trying to gain access to some very specific information. And as a result of that, we have to accelerate the cybersecurity initiative, and we really expanded the scope of what are we doing. And ultimately, that meant that our CEO, Satya Nadella, he declared that security is our #1 priority above everything else. Now, you've heard Joseph talking about AI. Microsoft is heavily invested in AI. We're heavily invested in gaming. We've been around in those 50 years, remember? But ultimately, Satya turned around and said, when you have a list of things to do, you've always got priorities. Security's #1. What does that mean ultimately? So we talk about this concept of secure by design, secure by default, and secure operations. Secure by design, secure by default, nothing new, is it? We've been talking about that for a very, very long time. We all work in security. We really should have default settings. Now, Microsoft has embedded security into a lot of our tools. You might be utilizing Office, you might be using Azure, you might be using Defender, Sentinel, all of those things. Now, historically, we've put those tools in place, but we said, it's up to you. It's up to you, dear customers, how you configure it. It's up to you in terms of how you make sure those things are turned on. More and more, we are going to turn them on for you out of the box. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of these principles and what do they mean ultimately. So it's underpinned by 6 engineering areas: identity, tenants, networking, engineering systems, and that's really then told how the speed in which we can detect and respond. And it's this kind of continuous point that goes through that. Now, everything really does stem through identity. Identity has overtaken endpoints as the primary attack vector. So when we're talking about how do you engineer, this is all about how do we increase the level of machine-to-machine authentication. How do we have phish-resistant credentials? And we really have swapped out huge amounts of effort. So we've got 220,000 people in Microsoft. We've gone through a huge amount of effort to make sure that we're putting in MFA. MFA by default, all admins, 100% of the time, 100% of users. Now, the second thing on the list, tenants, is very, very interesting. Now, I said 220,000 people, 100,000 of those are actually engineers. Now, we have to run faster than all of our customers combined. Not just because of the threat actors, but we've got multiple regulations, multiple requirements. We can't just turn around and say, there's a new regulation coming out on Monday. What are we going to do about it? So in essence, it's not unusual for our engineers to be downloading stuff off the internet. They use a lot of open source software. And their whole idea is they're experimenting. They're spinning up VMs all over the place. They're testing it. They're doing all these things. Not necessarily they're engineers, sorry if you're engineers, not necessarily good per se, at closing those things down and deleting them afterwards. So in essence, we ended up with 6.3 million tenants in the Microsoft domain only. This is not our customers that we had to shut down. So systematically shutting down all of these things that are being set up in the background. And what we identified, particularly with some of these threats, a lot of the time we put security controls, monitoring, high levels of monitoring in our production environment. Maybe you don't necessarily put the same level of security and monitoring in your destined dev. We do now. Now, networking, we've got to have this whole principle of assumed compromise. And we know sometimes for the threat actors, it's pot luck if they've got somebody with the right credentials. And we know they need an admin, right, if they're trying to gain access to some of these areas. And it's not always easy. They've got to keep laterally moving. They have to kind of keep elevating their privilege. So what are we doing instead? We're going through reams and reams of micro-segmentation across our network. So in essence, even if you could try and get in, you're stuck with what you're trying to do. So the fourth thing is around engineering. This is about how we look at code, in essence. How do we get code out? We are actually changing the entirety of our code base for all systems to Rust. And we're also investing and working with Google and Amazon about how do you secure open source software. So there's a huge amount of work that's going on into securing our code, getting code out there, and making sure we're actively scanning all of those things all of the time. And the really interesting is how do you detect and how do you respond really quickly? And I'll draw your attention to the very, very last point. Now, interestingly enough, anybody, including yourselves, can come to Microsoft and say, I found a vulnerability in your network. Now, that means that Microsoft, in essence, has to reverse engineer, understand how it works, what is it detected to, what's its ultimate game, is it like dormant, is there AI involved? Build a patch, deploy the patch, test the patch. Now, in essence, industry standard at the moment is 90 days. We've committed to do that in 45 days. How do you do that? Well, Joseph talked about AI. We're heavy investing in AI to speed up our response and speed up what we're doing. The really interesting thing behind that, though, is culture. We have 220,000 people, I remember. All of those people now have an objective security in their appraisal. Now, not all 220,000 people are actually technology people. You have the same as everyone else. You have HR, you have finance, you have salespeople. And it really is about how do you bed security everywhere. And this is about introducing and making sure that security is thought about, is really embedded into your mindset, no matter who you are, no matter what you're doing. Now, this is a fairly busy slide. I'm not expecting you to sit there and read it all, but these are just examples. Or whatever you're thinking about from a technology perspective, how is security? Understand the threat actor, understand their motivation, understand what is their ultimate objective, how committed they are to that objective, and were they able to fulfill that objective, what could they do with the data or the access that they have? So work backwards. We're actively threat modeling, red teaming consistently all of the time. This is making sure we're always introducing engineering principles. We're making sure we've got logs. Now, the interesting is Storm 0558, that very first threat actor. They were very, very clever in what they did. Do you know what? It took them 2 years to build the infrastructure to be able to exploit the credentials that they found. Because ultimately, when you show your hand, you lose your hand. Now, one of the things that was interesting is Microsoft didn't have logs going back 2 years. We do now. And this is the key principle, is making sure you've got audit records, making sure you've got logs and different tiers of logs that are available to you. But that's all great, you being an employee. What support are you getting from the rest of the business? So as managers, we're going to make sure that you have got the time and the ability to do training and awareness. You've got a level of psychological safety behind you. You are active targets for these threat actors. Remember, you work in IT, you work in security. You've probably got privileged access. So that being the case, what am I doing as a manager to help you to be secure? What am I doing to train you? What am I doing to make sure that when you identify a problem, if you yourself is being actively targeted in some way, what are we going to do about it? So it's this whole principle of really being very clear that security is every single person's level of accountability. Now, since putting this in, the entirety of our organization have just gone through their appraisals. 220,000 people have just been appraised on their secure priority. But that's not all, right? So we build consumer products. So how do I have security by design? How am I building this into all of the things that we do? And this is about being intuitive. You as a person or as a user, as a consumer, shouldn't have to think about security. You shouldn't have to think about, is my data secure? You shouldn't have to think about, is my device secure? You shouldn't have to think about, am I being actively targeted? So all of these things are just there. You can just get on, do what you need to do, and be secure by default. This means the people designing the product, even if you're marketing, you're engineering, all of those people need to think about the end consumer, who is using this product, what are they expecting. Now, again, this is a fairly busy slide. There's just some examples, really, of the kind of things that we're talking about. So the identity, as I said, identity is core to everything. How do we authenticate? How do we protect privileged access? How do we make sure that we're actively monitoring? How do we make sure MFA is the default setting for everything, no matter what? How do we improve data? How do we prevent data loss prevention? How do we give policy tips when someone's trying to do something they wouldn't normally do? And how do we make security that default setting, irrespective of what you're doing? And how do we communicate to users? How do we make sure that no matter what they're doing and how they're doing it, that they know how to be secure, how to actually work with these different tools and technologies. And what Microsoft has basically determined is everything that we have learned, everything that we are doing in terms of these engineering principles and practices, and this goes across the entirety of our company. It's how we think about data centers, it's how we think about networks, it's how we think about our people, it's how we think about our culture. It's how we think about our customers and ultimately how this is going to continue to evolve. So part of this commitment, we have decided that we are going to publish all of our engineering principles and practices. You know, thinking, oh, hang on a minute, Microsoft, doesn't mean that you're putting yourself at risk by exposing all of those things to the threat actors. But actually, it's really important, because if we're going to say secure by design and secure by default, that means it's not just about Microsoft security, it's about everyone's security. Now, we have this principle, don't we, again, of this thing called shift left. That security shouldn't be the last thing that we do before it goes live. It should be the very, very first thing. And we're taking it one step further. It's start right, stay right, get right. And this is about embedding those security principles into our engineering practices, making sure we've got the right tools, the right scanning, the right principles. So the minute anything comes on our network, it automatically assumes an identity. It automatically starts getting monitored. You cannot do anything, you cannot remove anything without all of those principles. Now, our data classification now has been turned on by default. Every single document is now Microsoft confidential, even if it technically isn't, because if you've got to think about it, if I'm reliant on somebody else knowing it's confidential and that data being breached in some way, then what are we going to do about it? So it's not just shift left, it's start right, stay right, get right. And in the last couple of weeks, we have started to publish all of our patterns and practices. And in essence, this is full-blown, detailed engineering principles about how exactly do you do all the things that I've just been talking about? How do you build phish-resistant credentials? How do you stop lateral movement? How do you remove 6.3 million tenants, 6.5 I think it was? You've got to know that they're out there. You need to know they're dormant. You need to know who's accessing it. And also, what is the net effect if I suddenly start deleting all of these things from my environment? And bearing in mind, Microsoft has to run all of these things live. We don't have the luxury of doing this at 3 o'clock in the morning on a Sunday, because the cloud's 24/7, it's always up. So imagine doing all of these things in that live environment. We've got to have those secure development pipelines. So how do you do engineering? How do you do DevOps? And how do you do it properly? How do you scan the code? How do you test it? How do you verify to your business that we've done enough security? I know it's a bit of a weird word. There's never enough security, right? To be able to go live. And ultimately, it's about having a complete inventory. I know this is one of the hardest things, config management, but then ultimately, as I sort of said, I'm not relying on somebody creating an identity. I'm relying on the fact that the minute I put it on the network, it automatically assumes an identity, automatically creates me an inventory, and I automatically are looking at anomalies all the time using the AI, using the smallest thing, behavior analytics. And when I do detect something, what am I going to do about it? So it's about having those logs, those different tiers of logs. I know it's easy. It's all right, Microsoft, you're a massive big tech. When I talk about having 2 years worth of data, how am I going to gain access to that? And a constant vulnerability management. So just to kind of finalize before we go to questions, what's next? Now, there's a little bit of another incident that happened last year, if you remember that thing with CrowdStrike. Well, we've been working with CrowdStrike and a number of endpoint detection teams to build Windows 11 is the most secure operating system we've ever built. So we are creating the Windows Resilience Initiative, which has said all those things I said, turning them on by default. That is exactly what we're talking about with Resilience. Over the next month, you're going to get a new SFI report, Secure Future Initiative, new websites coming, and with full-blown engineering patterns for everybody, so you can see exactly what to do and how to do it. So thank you, and we'll go to questions. Thank you very much.
Sarah, thank you very much. Fascinating, very spirited talk. Thank you. What could be potentially quite dull, I think you made very engaging.
How dare you, dull?
You made it quite engaging, I think, for us all to listen to, and I think gave us a great overview of what a massive change this has been for Microsoft. So this has only happened in like 2 years now? 3 years?
2 years. Complete rebuild of everything.
That's unbelievable to turn that around in such a small time, and Microsoft, the behemoth that it is.
Yeah, well, we've dedicated 34,000 engineers.
Just to this?
Just to this program. So that's why I said it was the biggest engineering program in history. You could imagine just the time, the effort, and all of the things. So you've got to build all of that and keep the cloud up and running at the same time.
Did I understand that you've got a program, or Microsoft has a program, pardon me, to rebuild everything in Rust, or how far does that extend?
Yes, our entire code.
Every code base?
Every code. And you've got to think there's millions of lines of code.
Millions doesn't begin to cut it, I think, of every... So we're talking every Microsoft product that you currently ship and the next version, or, I mean, I imagine that's going to take a number of years to get around that.
It's the plan. We have very ambitious plans. And when we talk about some of these targets and some KPIs, we said they all have to be 100%. And you think, well, how hard is it to get anywhere near 100%? I think sometimes we're lucky if we get 99.99 whatever. But actually what we said is, if you don't have 100%, that leaves that small percent of opportunity for the threat actor. And that's all they need. That's what they're looking for. They're looking for the smallest vulnerability, the smallest gap. And that's what we identified, is they're constantly scanning and they're constantly looking for a way in. And we talk about the fact that security is this cat and mouse game. But for everything that we're building today, give it 6 months, give it a year, threat actors will have found a way through. So I think one of the interesting things is, although we started this initiative with some very specific objectives, the reality is it might never end. Because the risk is constantly evolving, the threat actors are constantly evolving. We've got to keep moving the technology forward. And as I say, Microsoft actually has to run faster than everybody. So if you're dependent on that technology, and that the technology is deeply embedded into so many organizations, that's why we said you've got to have that kind of level of default and that level of design. That means you're halfway there. You're not having to start from scratch every time. Sure. So it's a tremendous amount of effort and work that's required.
I suspect it is closer to what you say. It's a never-ending process, but I see the wisdom or the logic in near the end. You were saying you released all of the how-tos, all of the engineering guides, all of this information. Essentially, to my mind, what that's doing is open sourcing all of these ideas. Now, if you are the first truly huge company to publish all this information, well, it might become a standard or some sort of basis or what the next large company uses, and then it evolves from there. So I can see the wisdom that, if you want everyone else in the world to iterate on what you've done here, then it makes sense to open it up.
I think that's the challenge. If you talk about multiple different regulations and standards, I think when you think about how long it takes to come out, the technology's already moved on. I think we're talking about AI with Joseph, and there's still not enough regulation when it comes to AI. But when it does come out, the technology is already light years ahead. And that's the problem. So you have to be dynamic to the risk as it's happening right now. So that means that we're having to keep setting the benchmark. We set the benchmark, and then we're having to lift the benchmark. And that ultimately means that's the reality that we are living in, because as we sort of said at the beginning, we've got some really, really aggressive threat actors out there. Very, very committed threat actors with a lot of resource. We bring AI into the mix. And we're obviously we're going head to head with a lot of that technology and know-how. But I think this is ultimately where we come from, is that when we all come together and we really think about that shift left, get right principle, we make it harder for the threat actors ultimately. And I think this is really important. This is what we learn, is about sharing those lessons, a little bit of vulnerability, but also that what are we doing about it, and how does everybody lift themselves up at the same time?
It seems like, you are setting a high standard, and that even, we've heard that several times today. I'm thinking already in the morning of Jaya, who was saying, if you're just, I think it was Jaya, who was like, if you're just reaching compliance, it's not good enough, right? You need to be pushing yourself forward. If you're just waiting for the law to tell you what to do, you're done, you're cooked. Like, you need to be setting that your own high standard. In a little bit of time we have left to switch tracks a little bit, you spoke about every Microsoft employee has been rated for security and audited or evaluated, you were saying. Now, I guess we can already in my mind, I can imagine how a engineer, technical person might get rated on their code, on their access levels. How do you rate and how do you evaluate a non-technical person? How does the HR person get evaluated for security at Microsoft?
Well, you think about HR, and I think it's unique to, well, it's not unique to anyone else, really. It's the fact that we all have HR departments, we all have people who are handling data, personal data, and it's just getting themselves into that mindset, really, that how does your little part contribute to the whole? Because everybody has a role to play, and everybody's role is equally as important in terms of keeping Microsoft secure. Because as we sort of said at the beginning, from a threat actor's perspective, I either have a very, very specific objective, and I'm highly invested in trying to gain access to specific people, or I'm scattergunning. I'm scattergunning to anybody. So I could just be potluck. I'm going to a HR person, I'm going to someone in finance, I'm going to whoever in the organization. But they've all got access to technology. They've all got access to data. And it's really then trying to understand, how do you help Microsoft as a whole be a trusted entity, and you have a level of responsibility with regards to that data and the expectations of that data. So for HR, there are expectations of our employees with regards to how that personal data is being managed. We have people who work in very sensitive environments, so there's an extra level of control that might be needed against those individuals, but there's also regulatory requirements as well. And I think that's the important bit, is how do I contribute to the big picture, and that everybody does contribute. And I think that's the beauty of having that cultural element. It's not just technology focused, it really is about changing mindsets for everybody.
And that's really have got to come from the top only. You said Satya was, he's on it, he's saying this, and there's no other way this could have been done without all of those senior leaders saying that.
I think an interesting thing, even with Satya, he basically said, this is so important. When I say security is the #1 priority, I absolutely mean it. And ultimately, the buck stops with me, because I'm the CEO.
Oh, good.
So when you're looking at, this kind of whole pyramid of the level of accountability, it's not just the role of the CISO, as we've said, it's the entire company. And it is ultimately, I need to lead from the top down. So everybody understands where that kind of is coming from, the level of accountability and importance that's assigned to that.
I love it. Oh, I love ownership. I love it. It's fantastic. I think it's what changes organizations and makes them work. And it's very heartwarming to hear that coming from Microsoft. So Sarah, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you. Thank you.